Thank you for your patience. Welcome everyone to the 21st Marrakech International Film Festival. It's really a great pleasure and a privilege to host this conversation with the vital Australian filmmaker, Justin Kurzel, whose riveting and explosive thriller, The Order, opened this festival a few days ago and had a great screening. His work spans countries and genres, and his Australian work looks at dark elements of the country's recent and distant history, while making salient commentary on the present. He has had a rich history and journey with the Marrakech Film Festival. His debut feature, Snowtown, won the jury prize here in 2011, and in 2022 he served here on the jury. We are really very grateful that Justin is here with us today, and please give him a warm, welcoming round of applause.
Thank you.
Justin, I'd like to begin by talking about your newest film, The Order, and I think first let's have a look at the trailer. It's a fantastic film. It's an American story about a white supremacist plot to overthrow the government and the intense investigation to thwart their plans. But it's also the story of people seeking belonging, who go down a bad path in seeking that sense of connection with others. Which is something in common with some of your previous works, which we're going to speak about a bit later. But I'd like to know what drew you to this particular story in the first place?
Well, it was Zach Balin who wrote the script, sent it to me, and I've been looking for an American film to do. And a lot of the films that I sort of defined me had a huge impact on me as a young film school student, and were those kind of classic 70s, early 80s American films of William Friedkin and Sidney Lumet, and I'd even say films like Mississippi Burning that Alan Parker kind of did, and these sort of very grounded, classic kind of Americana films. So there was an attraction there within the genre and just what was sort of coming off the page. But it was really after January the 6th and the storming of the Capitol building that I started to see images and influences from the Turner Diaries that feature so heavily in the film. So there were these sort of prop nooses that were replicas of one of the chapters in the book called The Day of the Rope, where in this particular book, the Turner Diaries, the politicians were going to be hung outside the Capitol building, and then there were people that were seen holding the Turner Diaries on January the 6th as well. So it suddenly kind of clicked into, even though it was from the past, a very present story, and that was it really. And it's a very unusual thing to do, to find a story that is sort of happening from the past, but is having a very direct conversation and presence to today. So that was probably how it all happened. And as we've been editing it, and we shot it, and it's been released, it's the point of it is definitely kind of sharpened as to kind of what it's trying to have a conversation with today.
Absolutely. I read recently, I think we can sometimes conveniently think that white supremacism is a really niche belief, but a very recent New York Times article stated that white supremacist incidents are rising, happen almost weekly, and that more than 750 public incidents have taken place since 2020. Were you quite disturbed as you did research for the film to find out what's happening presently?
Well, I'm astonished at how normalised it's becoming. Like, a lot of these groups, like The Order, were so fringe, and the Turner Diaries was something that was sort of really sitting back in the shadows. What alarms me now is that there is a kind of that these groups are becoming much more common and visible, and there's a kind of normality that's sort of happening with how they're placed. So that's definitely, like, this was a untold story. It was really hiding away, and the events were largely not reported or sort of documented. And the Turner Diaries was sort of something that you wouldn't have sort of heard about. Now it's becoming very common in terms of its citing and the way it's being sort of quoted. So that is definitely kind of it was on my mind that there is a sort of normalisation of a lot of these ideologies and a lot of these groups that are sort of hitting mainstream a little more. Yeah.
Let's go back to the beginning. You mentioned some of the American directors who had a great influence on you. What were the Australian films and filmmakers who influenced you when you were coming up?
Well, it was mainly Australian films. I was there was the Australian film industry was incredibly buoyant and thriving. My sort of heroes growing up were Peter Weir, and with films like Gallipoli, and Bruce Beresford with Picnic at Hanging Rock, and Jane Campion. There was a real vigour and a celebration in Australia of kind of voice. And even on our local kind of channel, the ABC, every Saturday night they would play Australian films. So as a kid, I remember my parents, really watching them. It was a sort of sit down on a Saturday night to watch a sort of indie Australian film. So that's where I sort of got to know Paul Cox's films, and then there was this other side to Australian filmmaking that was really raw and quite vigorous and muscular, which were films like Mad Max, and a whole lot of Ozploitation films that came out of this particular period, which sort of occurred because of a tax break where you could almost get 100% return on your films. So you got all these films that were being made in Australia at the time where there was no sort of worry about what they would do. People would be quite happy to see them not hit the screens, but you got these incredibly interesting and bold and kind of crazy films that were, set in dystopians and were kind of, I guess, talking a lot to horror. And they became a really big influence as well. So I was very lucky. I was just surrounded by Australian film. They were probably more celebrated than American films. And it was really, really big influence.
As we'll talk about a bit later, things have changed quite a lot. You can't imagine watching an Australian film every Saturday night at 8 o'clock on the ABC these days, could you?
No, it was vital. Yeah. It was, and I loved, I think it was the first time hearing and seeing Australian characters or people that I, recognised when I was down at the pub with my father. There was sort of dialogue coming out of those kind of arguments and fights and wonderful kind of revelry that I was seeing on the screen, and it was the first time I sort of understood that, that that this world I was sort of living, and my parents' friends and my friends, that there was that it was valid to kind of have a kind of cinema that explored, what was sort of happening around me, and the kind of landscape that it was in Australia.
When did you feel that you had to add to that body of work, that you had to become a filmmaker?
Well, I knew I was really, I was quite captivated by sport, like most Australians are, and we either play cricket or we play football or we swim, and sports people in Australia are kind of considered our most important people, and I was very addicted to sport, and was going to play professional tennis. So my brother and I sort of had goals of winning the Australian Open, and all our heroes were tennis players. But I remember there was a sort of moment there where I was much more interested in the storytelling of the sport, and I would pretend to be a sportsman that I knew and dress like that sportsman, and if that sportsman, like I remember playing tennis, and if the tennis player that I really loved was left-handed, even though I was right, I'd play left-handed just to kind of play out the story of what the film was in my head. So I grew up in a country town. I was surrounded by sort of very little other than sort of paddocks of nothing, and I was sort of desperate to kind of get out of the town. So my way of doing it was to recreate worlds and I guess recreate sort of stories that changed my reality a little. So it happened pretty early on that I realised I loved cinema and wanted to sort of be part of it. But I went into theatre. I was a theatre designer, production designer, and was surrounded by rehearsal rooms and actors, and it was really from there that I kind of went, okay, well, I'm actually not interested in production design. There's something really interesting going on in the rehearsal room, and I sort of was very interested in photography, and it felt like, okay, there might be maybe instead of a theatre director, I should sort of move into film, and it seemed the right kind of avenue for me.
It was before I'd moved to Australia, but I remember seeing your extraordinary debut feature, Snowtown in Cannes, in 2011, and I was really staggered by it. Let's take a look at a clip, and then we'll have a talk about Snowtown. Snowtown looks at a notorious serial killer, a violent murderer, but is not so much preoccupied with the violence. It's far more concerned with the relationships between the ringleader and a young accomplice in particular, and the social conditions that lead to the killings. Why were you determined that this story, based on true events, a dark story, would be your first feature film?
Because I grew up in the area, and I kind of knew, it's quite a disadvantaged area in South Australia, and what's kind of fascinating about the area is that there was numerous cases of pedophilia in the area, and kids that were being abused not only by family members but by people who are sort of living next door and living within the community. And this was a very unusual case. It was a serial killer who came into town and really started acting out these vigilante attacks towards these pedophiles who were preying on these kids. So it had a really interesting kind of Western type feel at the beginning. This idea of someone who had a evil in them that was coming in to kind of save the day. So there was a sort of hope that he was sort of bringing to these kids, and I got that. Like I sort of connected with those kind of really charismatic male figures that suddenly would listen to you, and would sort of become mentors, and they were very prominent in my life. They were very influential figures, and I admired a lot of them deeply. And John just had the same traits as these sort of men that I can remember, but obviously had an evil in him that reveals itself throughout the film. That he's a psychopath who is actually teaching this poor kid to kill and to find pleasure in that killing. So it was a film that was very personal in terms of where it happened. We shot where the murders actually occurred in the particular town. We used all non-actors that we cast, apart from John, who plays the serial killer, that we cast from the area, from shopping centres to knocking on doors and to open kind of casting calls, where we I just wanted an authenticity and something that I remembered sort of on screen. So I think that were the sort of main reasons. There's sort of corruption of innocence that I was really curious about. But there was something in Jamie that I kind of went, okay, I know why. I know how you got into this position,
I guess when I moved to Australia and I started speaking to people about the Australian films I'd seen most recently and spoke with such great admiration about Snowtown, I got the sense from some, not from everyone, but from some, that they prefer that Australian films didn't tackle this sort of heavy stuff. That Australian cinema should be more films about nice things instead.
Yeah.
And now this is something you've consistently
avoided.
Resisted in your Australian work.
Yeah.
Why?
I guess because they never felt true to me. I think there's a humour in Australia, and I think there's a colour, and I think the landscape and the people, are really vibrant and kind of extraordinary and fun and funny. But I saw sort of amongst that a kind of a kind of darkness that I was really intrigued about, that I saw around me. And, you know, I think that there is still a lot of... there's a conversation that we need to have in Australia about the violence that was, you know, that is sort of embedded in our history towards the Indigenous, that we've never really kind of tackled, confronted and talked about. And I think that there's an ongoing kind of shadow that, you know, that definitely kind of sits there, that I saw as a kid. And I guess also the films that I was always interested in, like I was always going towards the sort of romper stompers and choppers, and an amazing film, probably one of the most extraordinary films to come out of Australia, called The Boys, that I connected to much more than Priscilla, Queen of the Desert. And, you know, so I was, you know, I felt there was a truth there. I felt there was, you know, I tell this story like on Snowtown. This is Australia to me. I was at a pub and I was talking to someone who knew of the murders and of some of the people involved, and we were having a drink, and he was a stranger and he was sitting there sort of drinking away, and I got to the end of my drink and I said, well, I have to leave now. And he said, no, well, let's have another one. And I said, no, I've got to leave. And he goes, look, just one more, you know, we're having a good conversation here, we're enjoying each other's company. And I said, no, really, I need to go. And he said, I'll tell you what you're going to fucking do. You're going to walk over to that bar, you're going to buy me a drink, and you're going to buy yourself a drink, and you're going to walk over and sit and have it with me. And I went, okay. So I walked over, I bought myself a drink and him a drink, and we sat down, and he looked at me, and then he went, now where were we? And that to me is kind of the Australia that I grew up with, which was these, you know, you could have, in 1 minute you could have these incredible, fun, raucous laughter kind of conversations, and in the next you're suddenly like, hang on, what's going on here? So there's always been an underbelly that I've always been fascinated by and always drawn to and curious, and somehow things sort of taps away, you know, as to kind of who we are and, you know, why we are who we are.
Thank you. In terms of scope, your next film was a dramatic change. You took on Shakespeare with a visceral, violent, visually stunning exploration of Macbeth, starring Michael Fassbender and Marion Cotillard. Let's have a look at the clip from Macbeth. One of the attractive prospects for you of taking this on was to work with Michael Fassbender in the role, and he really is terrific in the film. Beyond that, when approaching this most famous of works, what did you feel most compelled to bring to the story? What were your priorities in the retelling?
Well, the film actually sort of started with a battle scene and a kind of where you sort of felt as though Macbeth had been away for a year, 2 years, sort of fighting at war, and there was a kind of post-traumatic stress type feel of him, in that he was a combination of the warrior that he'd been and the kind of death that he'd been part of. And then there was something really interesting in the script about like in the play, it's hinted at this idea of the child that Macbeth and Lady Macbeth have dying. And I thought there was something really interesting about how the ambition of Lady Macbeth and Macbeth is sort of expressed through grief. And that was a very different sort of take to what I'd been involved. Like in the past, I'd actually designed Macbeth and knew it quite well. But it was just, there was something about the script, and I think Michael playing it, this idea of what the repercussions of war were, that violence was sort of something that was now ingrained and inbuilt and being sort of passed over, and maybe a normalisation too of that sort of violence. I mean, I actually saw, even though they are a big jump from something like Snowtown, I actually saw a lot of similarities in this sort of idea of the pleasure of killing and the pleasure of violence, and this sort of notion and idea of wrestling with guilt, but at the same time maybe accepting these new ideals within you, you know, that if you could shift your kind of morality a little, that you could kind of live with or even embrace a kind of violence that's sort of being taught in you. So there were definitely kind of links between those two, and I always saw Macbeth as a great Western. I went to Scotland and I kind of saw where it was written, and there's something really amazing about bringing that landscape and bringing that world, like you really do out there, in the moors, feel as though they're witches. They really do sort of speak to you. So to actually sort of bring that onto screen with those two actors as well was a massive attraction.
And then for something completely different, the next film is Assassin's Creed, an adaptation of a massive video game.
Yeah.
So 3 films in, and you have a really unusual trio stylistically, right? You have Snowtown, Macbeth, and Assassin's Creed. And then you return to your roots. You go back to one of the great Australian stories. You took on the Australian historical figure who has somewhat mythological status, Ned Kelly, with the film The True History of the Kelly Gang. Again, it's a story told in many iterations before, but you brought a freshness and a veracity to this cinematic version, one that is somehow both sensual and incredibly gritty. Let's have a look at a clip, and then we're going to talk about the film. It's awesome. I love that scene. Tell us about your approach to the film, both narratively and visually. As I said, there have been a number of versions before. What did you want to do to either build on those previous versions or totally repudiate them? What was your approach?
Well, it's the sort of thing that you don't do in Australia, is make a film about Ned Kelly, and because so many have been done, and for some reason, Ned Kelly in Australia is this sort of, he was a bandit, a kind of robber, and has for some reason become this kind of icon. In Australia, you'll get sort of Ned Kelly tattoos, there's Ned Kelly pies, there's Ned Kelly kind of, there's even in the Olympics when we were hosting in Sydney, there was a sort of whole section devoted to Ned Kelly, and he was a baddie. And there's something very interesting in how Australia kind of identifies itself with Kelly. And Peter Carey's book, True History of the Kelly Gang, was sort of about this idea of sort of writing Australian history and kind of the curiosity in sort of finding some sort of identity in this sort of figure and then bringing out sort of new meaning and mythology about him. So I was fascinated by that and kind of what that was. And there's a spirit in the Ned Kelly, in True History of the Kelly Gang, the book of, these guys were sort of 21, 22, 23, and there was a sort of anarchy about them and a kind of raucousness and a kind of energy that, is very, very Australian even today. So I was curious about whether you could tell this story, where it was speaking to the times in which it was set, but also have a kind of spirit about it that felt quite sort of modern and present. But it was, I don't know, I'd been in London and I'd just done Assassin's Creed. I hadn't had a great time on that film, and I was really wanting to come back home and just get sort of lost in the world of filmmaking again and really try some sort of bold stuff. And there's something about that book which is a sort of highway to hell in a way. You kind of, no matter how you make it, you're going to sort of start a conversation with it because everyone feels as though they know or they own Ned Kelly in some way.
True History of the Kelly Gang, like a number of your films, has you working with regular collaborators. Sean Grant, who wrote the screenplays of this film, Snowtown and Itram. Your brother Jed Kurzel, who's been the composer of all your films, I think. Your wife, the acclaimed actor Essie Davis, who's been in a number of your films. The cinematographer Adam Arkapour is another frequent collaborator. Tell us, and especially the young filmmakers in the room, about the benefits of this frequent collaboration.
I think it's everything. I think that, Adam Alice Babbage, Fiona Crombie, who were both designers and DOPs on Snowtown, my first film. And then Jed, my brother, it was the first film that he'd composed. I've just kept working with them, and I think that it's really important that those first-time collaborators that you have, like the people that you have around you now, especially with the film students, that's your tribe. That's the group that you're going to grow and become filmmakers with. So I was never really interested or feeling as though I wanted to be seduced by, the next level of DOP or practitioner. I was very interested in sort of growing with, those that were sort of around me. I think it's really important, especially in terms of voice. I think that if you can kind of connect to a collaboration and you sort of can anticipate each other's interests, then I do think you get something much bolder and much more unique on screen.
You're a great director of actors, whether working with some of the most famous actors in the world or new, barely known actors. You draw such incredible performances. Of the retinue of directorial duties, how highly do you rank drawing great performances from the actors?
I think it's everything. For two reasons. One is the film can look like absolute shit, but if those central performances are so engaging and seductive and most importantly true to what your style of the film is, but the audience can see that there is real focus on the performance, then that will cover anything else. And then secondly, if you want a career as a director, especially more so now, having actors wanting to work with you is very important. And that because it draws confidence in terms of the people that are funding your film, but it also marks to other actors that your focus, that they're going to be the most important people on set. So it's to me that sort of moment between action and cut, what actually happens in a performance. You might be reading something on a page or developing something on a page in the screenplay for years, but to get on set and to be able to find an authenticity with it, and if it's not coming, if the actors are just not connecting with it, or it's starting to feel contrived or over-rehearsed or so forth, to be able to maneuver and get something really surprising is probably the most important thing for me. So I think they're everything. And I get the most kick out of actors. I'm married to one. I love being around them, and it's they're the ones that bring the kind of energy.
Speaking of great performances, let's talk a bit about Nitram, which won the lead actor Caleb Landry-Jones the Best Actor Prize at the Cannes Film Festival 2021. It's a film that looks at the notorious 1996 massacre in Australia in Port Arthur, Tasmania, in which 35 people were killed, and delves into the family life of the shooter and the series of events that led to the shooting. Let's have a look at the clip from Nitram. As is usually the case, before the film was even seen, it was condemned by some. Some said it would be a glorification of the killer, or the story would be sensationalized, or it was simply wrong to tell the story from the perspective of the killer. You were incredibly articulate, I felt, at the time in your defense of the film, and I still do think so now. Could you tell us what steps you took while making the film to be sensitive to the criticism you could predict was coming?
It was tricky. So this event in Australia changed the gun laws. It was at the time one of the biggest massacres that had ever happened with gun violence in the world, in terms of a massacre. So it was a sort of taboo subject to talk about, and in Australia there'd been painters and writers that had been or tried to kind of express something about these events, and had been kind of shut down. And Sean sent me this script, We'd worked on True History of the Kelly Gang and Snowtown, and you know, I was sort of terrified to open it. I kind of knew what it was about sort of straight away, but I just read this thing, and it was, I just felt like I knew, or I'd seen and understood kind of who this man was more than what had been sort of reported, and I guess the kind of I don't know, the guy that had been you know, not talked about. There was just something that I just felt like he was the one next door. You know, there was something very. It was interesting. It was different from Snowtown, which was in a very sort of disenfranchised sort of neighbourhood. This was a sort of figure that everyone knew, was very social, was very present, which made it even more shocking in terms of the events that he was sort of part of at the end. But there was just something in the script I knew was human and was a kind of, there was something about being a mother too and family, and I think that point of view that Sean brought to parenting and the pressure and the anxiety that you feel towards what you give your children, and how you deal with, you know, the anxiety of a child and the problems that can occur through, you know, them just growing up. So there was a kind of I don't know, there was something about it that I was terribly surprised by in regards to, I feel like I know this world. And at the time in Australia, and it still is in a way, it's sort of unspeakable. So I knew I had to make it. I knew that I was going to get, you know, that it was going to be confronting for many, and that we would be having to defend it, and you know, and in some way we're still sort of defending the film back home.
Nitram, like many of your films, examines violence and masculinity, and goes into the social intricacies underpinning this violence. What is it that fascinates you about this subject?
I don't know. I find it really hard to answer this question. I've been asked a lot, and I know that it's in my work. I guess I was surrounded by some pretty kind of hard men, and I didn't, you know, the role models, I think, male role models are really important in Australia. There's a kind of question about masculinity and what that is, and usually it's connected to, at times, a violence. And you know, I guess that it's something that I saw growing up. It's something that was sort of around me, and it keeps on being part of my kind of orbit. I don't, you know, I'm kind of reaching to kind of understand it more. You know, why men create these acts of violence to others and to each other. It's and especially in Australia, there's something about that place that has a very particular type of violence that, you know, is it's just been around me. So I've kind of been searching and trying to understand and unpick it in a way. But it's never been a conscious thing, but it's always been something I've sort of been more and more curious about. I thought it would have stopped by now, but I'm still, you know, I'm still sort of interested in it. Yeah.
We spoke the other day about the difficulty in getting intelligent, serious films made these days in Australia, but beyond too. As a director who's mainly made feature films, but also recently a lovely documentary about the musician Warren Ellis and a television series, The Narrow Road to the Deep North, I still get the very strong sense that your true love will always be the feature film. Is that true, and if so, why?
Because I think there's a discipline in it and a point of view in it that is very particular with film. I think that usually what happens, you've got 90 to 120 minutes usually, where you have to shape and craft a point of view of a kind of singular character, and it's like a race car. Like I think that, you know, with television, I think a lot of it is about content and filling that content. And I think, you know, you can have an episode where it doesn't, where it's inconclusive what's going on at the end of, you know, ep 1, but then with 3 and 4 you can sort of pick it up again, and it can lag in certain areas. Like, it's very forgiving. And what I've always loved about film is that it has to be so precise. It's just this sort of bullet. And I think the discipline of it is so important. I also think it's where auteurs are kind of born. I think, you know, filmmaking to me is being in a cinema and thinking, okay, I'm in the hands of someone that knows what they're doing, that is trying to immerse me in a particular kind of vision. And I still feel as though it's a medium where directors lead. I think it's different in television. Obviously, there are cases where you've got a director working with a writer that is show running the whole thing, but predominantly directors are coming into something, and there's something diluted about their influence over it. So I think cinema is this wonderful medium where that camera is, where that point of view is, what the tone and the texture of the film is, it comes from that director. And, you know, it's almost like a pure expression of what that discipline is. So I think I will always be, you know, interested in it. I think it's becoming harder and harder to make independent films. I think that the resources there are becoming more and more scarce, and it's tricky. I think independent cinema's, you know, going through a tricky phase. Well, it has for many years, but particularly now, it's a hard place to make things, and the budgets are decreasing, and the schedules are decreasing, and you know, but we still need these kind of stories to be told. So yeah, so we'll see where it goes, I guess.
Thank you. We have a short time for your questions, so we'll take questions from the audience for a bit. We have a question here.
Hello everyone, thank you so much for being here in Morocco. And my question is, what's your advice for a young filmmaker who doesn't have a chance for studying at film school? And thank you.
Well, I think just watch as many films as you can, and watch them over and over again, and really try to kind of teach yourself what you like and what you think is relevant to you as a filmmaker. Because at the end of the day, that's all that's important. All that's important is your vision. You know, that's all that's what's going to separate you from other filmmakers, is your take on what cinema is for you. And the only way you can find that is by watching as many films as possible and sort of understanding what you gravitate to, and just make films. I mean, you know, you're filming me now. You can, you know, take a phone and where you put that phone, you know, and what perspective you are with those with your subject matter is straight away telling a story from the choices you're making as a filmmaker. So I think it's, you know, it's accessible. And then I would say use your friends, you know, as actors. You know, really sort of, Shane Meadows, who's a British director, he did a wonderful series called This Is England, and wonderful independent films in the sort of 90s, early 2000s, you know, Dead Man's Shoes and Room for Romeo Brass. He was studying visual arts in Sheffield, and across the road was the film school, and he pretended that he was a film student instead of visual arts student, and went to the school every day and just rented out or just took out the cameras. And he told me he would have made something like 90 films that year, and some of the films were just a two-hander like this and one shot, and it would go for 30 seconds. And he said that he didn't go to the classes because he wasn't supposed to be at the school, but he was taking the equipment out just to play with this experimentation of what you know, what it is that you like, where you put the camera, the sort of performance that you like, that's when it starts to hum. You know, it's doing it. You know, you don't need film school to do that. So as long as you start to sort of understand what you know, what the cinema that you love and the stories that you want to tell, then that's the most important thing.
We have some questions there.
Hello. I had a question about music. You mentioned that you made music with your brother. So what is your place in the collaboration for making music together? Thank you.
We used to start out where we would do, so I don't do temp music. So because I find with temp music you'll get another artist's work, or everyone sort of starts to sort of fall in love with that music and they can't get it out of their head for evolving it when you work with a composer. So Jed fortunately would do little sketches. It might just be a continuous riff on something that he would give after looking at the visuals and the work. Now we've got to a point where I won't even show him anything. I'll just sort of talk to him about, well, this is the feel of it, this is the tone, these are some pictures, and then I'll get him to start doing maybe 10 to 15 minutes of music even before he's seen the film, so that it you know, you're not composing music for cues. You're not using music for heightening emotion. You're actually creating a kind of, you know, a soundscape that you can, you know, that can run quite separately from the visuals, you know, and be quite independent from the visuals. And that's probably been our biggest evolution, working together, has been sort of actually composing the music almost before the film's shot.
Go ahead, we have a question. Sorry, you're next.
Hello, thank you for this conversation. We were really impressed by the fire scene in The Order. So we were wondering how it was made. Did you use CGI or a real fire?
Alberta, where we filmed in Calgary, was going through some of the biggest bushfires that there've been for some time. So we didn't even know whether we were going to be able to shoot that house on fire. But fortunately we were lucky, and they kind of passed, and we were able to kind of use real fire as much as possible. So I think CG fire looks like CG fire. Like, I've never been able to. It's so particular, the way fire bounces off walls, and the reflective light on fire is, I find, really easy to pick up, you know, when you're sort of seeing it on film in terms of it being a VFX. So I always try to have a source there. So for the windows and parts of the roof, and we had a real fire source, and then the visual effects team were able to take that source and then replicate it, change it a little bit and whatever. But whenever you use fire, as much as possible, use a real source, so that you can you can find an authentic way in which it's hitting the light, the way it's moving in the environment. That I always feel the visual effects fire feels separated from the image. It sort of feels like it's always on top rather than integrated into the actual frame.
So first of all, thank you so much for coming here. And my question, how do you choose the projects you work on?
I used to think about it a lot, and now I very much allow them to sort of come to me a bit. I used to be a real snob about what I wanted to do. So I would stick on something for a year, 2 years, and desperately try to get it up and put everything to that project, and then it would sort of, you know, eventually sort of fall over because of finance, or I'd lose an actor on it or whatever. And I've now learnt that, you really should have, well, for me, sort of around 5 or 6 projects that are being developed and that have the possibility of, finding their feet and, looking like they're going to go into, production. So to me, it's being open to that and being curious about, and I always find there's a moment where you've got someone else's script and you might not totally see it, why you want to do it. There's something there, you can't quite express it. But then when you start working on it, and you start talking about it with the writer, something happens. It suddenly becomes personal and it becomes yours. And just that investment back into it, it's amazing how you can kind of shift something that was completely foreign to you at the beginning into something that's sort of yours. I mean, Macbeth was that. I mean, I'd never in a million years did I think I would do a Shakespeare on screen. And I wasn't particularly interested in Shakespeare. But there was something, there was a kernel in that original script that then started to sort of grow. So I've become less precious and much more open to kind of what is speaking to me and what's got enough legs in it to be able to kind of grow and become something that's mine.
We'll take the final question. There we go. Go ahead.
Welcome, Justin. My question is how do you think Morocco's cinematic potential compares to other locations you've worked in and things?
In terms of storytelling or in terms of an industry, what I'm trying to understand the question a little more. Sorry.
Yeah, in the cinematic industry.
Right. Well, look, I tell you, I don't get to see many films from here. So, what I think is extraordinary is when I was on the jury, I had the opportunity of seeing some pretty diverse storytelling, and a couple films from Morocco, and what instantly comes across is how much more personal and intimate they are, and the storytelling feels much more authentic and bolder just in the vision. So there was a couple first, second-time filmmakers that we really responded to as a jury, and it was because they felt very sure-footed about the sort of vision and the sort of storytelling that they were trying to tell, much more than many other regions. And I've got to say, this is an amazing festival for you guys to be part of, to be able to kind of see these first, second-time films that are not far off where you're at in terms of what this next step is going from shorts into that longer form is really important. I don't know how many Australian film students would actually turn up to something like this, and it's really encouraging to see you all here. And I've been to all the talks throughout the last sort of 3 or 4 days, and the questions that come through, like the level of conversation, the sophistication of some of the questions is really impressive. So if you're an example of what the future of Morocco's film industry is, then it's really, really great.
We're going to take the last question.
Hello, Mr. Kurzel. Thank you so much for this conversation. I wanted to know more about your casting process with your actors. I was curious to know what moves you in an actor's performance and what makes you confident in an actor's ability to bring a character to life. Thank you.
I do these like little manifestos with actors because in the past I've found that an actor can be very intimidated by a role and by the preparation. So they'll get very heady and think a lot about where the character's from and the psychology of the character, and they're all valid things to kind of look at. But I really believe in actors doing things. So I do these little manifestos, which might be 40, 50 things for the actor to do, to experience, and that's in pre-production. So for example, Daniel, who was playing John Bunting, the serial killer, in the first 3 weeks, he just stayed in his hotel room and read books about serial killers from America. And it was doing nothing for what the practicality was of him playing this killer, because this killer was not a hermit and was not someone that shied away from society. They were actually incredibly social. And that's what was different about them. They'd be the person that would fix your car, and they'd be, at the pub until, 3 in the morning, and they'd be, cooking food for everyone at the local barbecue. Like he was an incredibly kind of present and social figure. So I got Daniel to do a whole lot of things that were very active about developing the relationships with the people around him. And some of those were to take the kids in the film camping, spend 3 days with them. To his wife in the film that he married was a non-actor. It was the first time that and I said, Daniel, you've got to go and pick her up from work and pick her kid up, and you've got to go and cook her a meal every night, and you've got to kind of, she's got to feel your support. And he did that for 6 weeks. He developed all these relationships, in really practical ways, with this ensemble of non-actors, so that when we arrived on set first day, the kids would just run to him and they'd be hanging off him, and Lou, who played his wife, would come up and kind of just automatically kind of put her arm around him, lean her head in, and that comes on screen, like that ease and that comfortableness that character needed to have with everyone was extremely important. So I always try to do, like for example, the Kelly gang. Those 4 boys, I only had 2 weeks with them, and they had to be a gang, and they had to be a really substantial gang, and they had to kind of have an ease with them, and all 4 actors didn't know each other. So what I did was I said to them, well, the only way you're going to get to know, I in the past know the quickest way for people to, connect is either through sport or through music. So I created a band. There was 4 of them there. None of them could play musical instruments. And I got them guitars and drum kits and stuff. And I said, in 2 weeks, you're going to perform at this pub in Melbourne. And it's a really full-on indie music pub. And you're going to have to do a set of 8 songs. And they went white. And I said, so you better choose punk, because the songs are shorter and you don't have to be good at playing your instruments, but you got to sort it out over the next 2 weeks. So that was their rehearsal, was them coming up with an album, which they did, of 8 to 9 songs. And then we all went a day before shooting, we all went to this pub, and no one knew that these were a group of actors. Everyone thought it was this hot new band in Melbourne, punk band. And 300 people turned up, and these guys came out with the dresses and started playing this punk set for 8 songs. And they were kind of terrible, but also kind of amazing, really amazing. And then the next day they walked on set and they were just all over each other. They were a gang, because they'd sort of gone. So I'm always trying to work out, how can you physically do something that connects an actor to a world, an environment. It's something that feels real to them rather than a head fuck of whatever, psychology or, thinking.
Thank you, Justin Kurzel. Thank you all for being here with us. Thanks so much.
Thank you. Thanks so much. It's a pleasure being here. Thank you, Nashen.